German tanks reached the Meuse River on December 19, 1944, and the bridges were still standing. For 3 days, American commanders had assured themselves that even if the Ardennes offensive achieved tactical surprise, the Meuse would hold. Engineers had demolition charges ready. Rear echelon units guarded every crossing. The river itself was an ancient barrier that had stopped invaders for centuries. But Kampfgruppe Piper, racing ahead of the main German advance with a speed that defied every Allied estimate, reached Huy before word of the breakthrough had even filtered back to Shaif headquarters. The American supply clerks and military police defending the bridges had rifles and determination they did not have anti-tank weapons. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The crossing at Huy took less than 2 hours. Panther and Tiger tanks rolled across spans that should have been rubble, their commanders scarcely believing their luck. Behind them, the 6th Panzer Army poured through the Losheim Gap with a momentum that Hitler's generals had privately dismissed as fantasy. The Führer had demanded Antwerp. Now, impossibly, the road to Antwerp lay open. What no one understood yet, what would take historians decades to fully grasp, was that everything about the post-war world had just changed. Field Marshal Montgomery received the news at his headquarters in Zonhoven on the morning of December 20th. German armor had crossed the Meuse, not approaching it, crossed it. The implications were immediately catastrophic. British supply lines ran through the very corridor that German forces now threatened. Montgomery had spent weeks arguing that Eisenhower's broad front strategy left the Allies dangerously overextended. He had been proven right in the worst possible way. Eisenhower, conferring with his commanders at Verdun, made the decision that would define his legacy. He ordered the immediate evacuation of supply depots throughout Belgium. Millions of gallons of fuel, thousands of tons of ammunition, rations for 500,000 men, all of it had to move or be destroyed before German forces could seize it. The logistics officers who had spent months building the infrastructure to sustain the final push into Germany now watched it being dismantled in hours. Montgomery pulled British units back toward Brussels, while the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions held a shrinking perimeter around Bastogne. Patton, already wheeling his Third Army north in a feat of operational brilliance, pushed toward the besieged paratroopers with everything he had. But the gap between northern and southern Allied forces was widening, not closing. And Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army was racing to make that gap permanent. The Germans entered Antwerp on Christmas Day, 1944. The city's defenders, a mixture of British rear area troops, Belgian resistance fighters, and hastily repositioned anti-aircraft units, fought block by block through the morning. But with German armor already controlling the eastern approaches and Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft appearing overhead for the first time in months, the outcome was never in doubt. The port itself presented German commanders with an unexpected gift. Allied engineers had planned extensive demolitions, but the speed of the German advance meant many charges were never set. Cranes stood intact along the quays. Warehouses still held supplies that evacuation convoys had been unable to reach. The harbor that had taken months to clear of German mines and open for Allied use now flew the swastika. Hitler, receiving the news at his Wolf's Lair headquarters, experienced what aides would later describe as euphoria bordering on mania. His generals, the ones who had dismissed Wacht am Rhein as a desperate gamble, had been wrong. He had been right. The Western Allies could be defeated. Germany could still win. But even in triumph, the constraints that had always doomed the offensive remained. German tanks sat idle for lack of fuel. Supply lines stretched back through the Ardennes over roads cratered by Allied bombing. And in the east, Soviet marshals studied their maps with growing interest. Patton broke through to Bastogne on December 27th. The 101st Airborne, having held out under conditions that would become legendary, finally saw friendly armor rolling into their perimeter. General McAuliffe's single-word response to German surrender demands, "Nuts," would echo through American military history, but Patton's relief of Bastogne could not undo what had happened at Antwerp. The Allied front was now irrevocably split. Montgomery's forces held a perimeter stretching from the Channel coast to the Somme, supplied through Cherbourg and the smaller Channel ports. Patton's Third Army and the remaining American forces in France formed a separate command to the south, dependent on the long supply line running up from Marseille through the Rhône Valley. Churchill flew to Paris for an emergency conference with Eisenhower. The Prime Minister arrived looking haggard, having spent the Channel crossing arguing with his own chiefs of staff about whether Britain should seek a separate peace. That option, he told Eisenhower, was unthinkable, but so was the current strategic reality. Eisenhower, shouldering blame that historians would later distribute more widely, presented the only viable plan. The Allies would hold what they had. They would rebuild their strength, and when the time came, they would counterattack. What he did not say, what everyone in the room understood, was that the timetable for ending the war had just been extended indefinitely. Stalin received hourly updates on the Western Front throughout December. The Soviet leader, who had previously agreed to coordinate a January offensive with the Western Allies, now saw an entirely different strategic landscape. The Vistula Oder operation, originally planned for mid-January, was moved forward. Soviet marshals Zhukov and Konev received orders to accelerate their preparations. Every day that the Western Allies remained divided was a day that Soviet forces could advance further before meeting resistance, or friends. More significantly, Stalin began rethinking the Yalta Conference scheduled for February. Roosevelt had hoped to negotiate Soviet participation in the Pacific War and cooperation on a post-war United Nations. Churchill wanted guarantees about Poland and the future of Eastern Europe. Both Western leaders had assumed they would be negotiating from a position of relative strength. That assumption was now obsolete. The Western Allies needed Soviet pressure on Germany more than ever. They needed Stalin's armies to force Hitler to fight on two fronts, and Stalin knew it. Instructions went out to Soviet diplomats. The price for continued cooperation would be higher than anyone had previously discussed. By February 1945, the Western Allies had established what Eisenhower privately called Fortress France. Defensive lines ran from the Somme River south to the Swiss border, anchored by American and British forces that had been reinforced with every available unit from Britain and the United States. The logistic situation, while stabilized, remained precarious. Cherbourg and Marseille together could not match Antwerp's capacity. American industrial output, the arsenal of democracy that had overwhelmed Axis forces across two oceans, now moved through ports that operated at a fraction of their potential. German forces, meanwhile, discovered that capturing Antwerp had not solved their fundamental problems. The port was operational, but submarine attacks in the Channel made resupply hazardous. Fuel shortages that had plagued the Wehrmacht throughout 1944 continued unabated, and Allied air forces, recovered from the weather that had grounded them during the breakthrough, now struck German positions with devastating regularity. The front lines barely moved through the winter. Germany lacked the strength to push further into France. The Allies lacked the logistical capacity to mount a major counteroffensive. Both sides settled into the grinding stalemate that generals had hoped to avoid. The Red Army reached the outskirts of Berlin on April 4, 1945, 3 weeks ahead of the historical timeline. Stalin's accelerated offensive had torn through German defenses weakened by the transfer of forces westward for the Ardennes operation. The very units that had made the Meuse crossing possible had left gaps in the Eastern Front that Soviet commanders exploited with brutal efficiency. But Soviet ambitions extended beyond Berlin. Racing north, elements of the Second Belarusian Front pushed toward the Baltic coast, aiming to cut off Denmark before Western Allied forces, still pinned in France, could intervene. Other Soviet units drove west through central Germany, establishing positions far beyond what any pre-war planning had anticipated. Churchill, watching the maps at his war rooms in London, understood what was happening. The post-war division of Europe was being determined not by negotiation, but by the physical position of armies on the ground. Every mile the Soviets advanced westward was a mile that would remain under Soviet influence for decades to come. Emergency messages to Roosevelt, now visibly declining in health, urged immediate action. But what action? The Allied forces in France could barely maintain their current positions. There was no realistic prospect of racing the Soviets to Berlin. Germany surrendered to Soviet forces on May 2, 1945. Marshal Zhukov accepted the capitulation in a ceremony held in the ruins of the Reichstag, surrounded by Red Army soldiers who had fought their way across a continent to reach this moment. The Western Allies were not present. Victory in Europe, such as it was, found American and British forces still holding their lines in France, unable to advance significantly since the winter. The liberation of the Low Countries and Western Germany that had seemed imminent in December 1944 had never materialized. Belgium remained under German occupation until Soviet forces arrived from the east. The Netherlands had endured a winter of starvation that continued until Soviet tanks reached Amsterdam. The post-war conferences that followed bore little resemblance to what Roosevelt and Churchill had envisioned. Soviet forces occupied not just Eastern Europe, but Germany itself, all the way to the French border. Denmark remained independent only through desperate last-minute diplomacy. The atomic bombs that ended the Pacific War in August demonstrated American technological supremacy, but could not undo the strategic realities established on the ground in Europe. Historians would debate for generations whether the outcome was inevitable once German armor crossed the Meuse. They would examine the intelligence failures that allowed surprise, the logistics decisions that left the Ardennes thinly defended, the weather that grounded Allied aircraft at the critical moment. They would assign blame and credit in proportions that shifted with each new archive opened and each new memoir published. But those who lived through it remembered something simpler. They remembered the moment when the news came through that Antwerp had fallen, and the faces of the officers who understood immediately what it meant. They remembered the winter of holding on, of knowing that victory would still come, but that it would look nothing like what they had imagined. They remembered the maps on the wall, the red arrows pushing westward, and the growing realization that they had won the war but lost the peace. The bridge at Huy still stands today, rebuilt after the fighting, carrying traffic that moves without thought of the hours when the fate of continents hung on its span. History flows beneath it, invisible and relentless, carrying the weight of choices made and chances lost toward a future that might have been so very different.